Welcome to History for Nap Time. Close your eyes, settle in, and imagine a world where coins were rare, banks did not yet exist, and most people's wealth could be carried in a wooden bowl or a single cow. Tonight's story asks a simple question. Do you think you would have been able to make money in medieval Europe? It was a time when earning a living depended not only on skill, but on birth, belief, and luck. From the muddy fields of England to the bustling markets of Florence, let's explore how people, poor, noble, and somewhere in between, found ways to turn effort into survival. Long before merchants shouted prices in crowded squares, Europe's economy was one of barter and obligation. In small villages, wealth meant grain in the granary or livestock in the pen. A farmer might trade a sack of barley for a pair of shoes. A miller might grind grain in exchange for a few days of labour. Even the church, the largest landowner of all, collected its share not in money but in goods, eggs, wool, or honey poured into stone jars at the monastery gate. Gold and silver coins did exist, but they were unevenly spread. A French peasant might never touch one. A German knight might hoard them in a chest for decades. To most people, money was a rumour, a thing that passed between cities but rarely reached the countryside. In those early centuries, your reputation was your credit. Promises and memory served where banks would later stand. For most medieval Europeans, money was not just rare, it was almost imaginary. The rhythm of their lives followed the seasons, not the market. They sowed in spring, reaped in summer, prayed in winter, and bartered through all. A peasant's economy began at home. The family was a tiny factory of survival, spinning, weaving, growing, and mending nearly everything they owned. When something was needed beyond their ability, they traded. A blacksmith mended a plough in exchange for cheese. A neighbour lent a cow in return for help at harvest. Coins, when they appeared, brought both possibility and danger. A silver penny was a rare treasure, enough to buy a chicken or pay a fine to a lord. But having coins meant exposure, thieves, taxes, suspicion. So most kept their savings in safer forms, a piglet, a bolt of cloth, or a secret measure of grain. Still, change was coming. By the 12th century, some peasants began to sell small surpluses at local markets, a few eggs, an extra sack of barley, hand-woven linen. Over time, these small trades created new habits, the habit of exchange, of thinking beyond the manor. In parts of England, free peasants known as yeomen began to accumulate small plots of land. In Flanders and northern France, peasants spun wool for export, earning wages in coins that connected them, however faintly, to the larger European economy. But even opportunity had its limits. Taxes and tithes were heavy. Every 10th sheaf went to the church. Every harvest owed labour to the Lord. Drought or frost could erase a year's effort overnight. Yet, within this fragile balance, the peasantry built Europe's foundation. They did not earn much, but they learned to live by trade, not just by toil. And in those humble exchanges, a handful of coins passed at market, a sack of grain sold under the church tower, lay the slow awakening of the modern economy. By the 12th century, Europe began to breathe again. Populations grew, trade routes reopened, and weekly markets sprouted like mushrooms after rain. In England, markets were royal privileges. A town needed the king's charter to trade legally. In France, they were tied to feast days. Pilgrims came for prayer and stayed to buy cloth and cheese. In Germany and the Low Countries, entire towns built their identity around trade: Bruges, Cologne, Lübeck. Market day transformed ordinary lives. Peasants sold surplus eggs or grain. Craftsmen displayed leather belts and iron nails. Minstrels sang news from far-off lands. And beyond the weekly bustle were the fairs, vast gatherings that could last weeks. The champagne fairs in France drew merchants from Italy, Spain, and England. Spices from the east, wool from the north, and silver from the German mines met there under colourful tents. For the first time since Rome's fall, Europe had a network of exchange again. Money flowed, ideas travelled, cultures met. To make money in medieval Europe increasingly meant one thing: to be part of this great movement of trade. Walk through a medieval town and you could tell its wealth by the sound of its tools. The clang of the smith's hammer, the hiss of dye vats, the rhythmic creak of the loom, all belonged to the guilds. Guilds were more than trade associations. They were families of skill. A young apprentice, often no older than 12, entered a master's workshop to live and learn. He slept beside the forge or under the loom, his hands blistered by practice and repetition. Years later, he would become a journeyman, travelling between towns to perfect his art. To earn the title of master, he had to produce a masterpiece, a single, flawless example of his craft. A sword balanced perfectly, a lock that turned smooth as silk, a tapestry whose threads told a story without words. Guilds ensured that every object bore not just function, but pride. A baker's bread was judged by weight and purity. A mason's stone had to fit within a hair's breadth. A goldsmith's coin, if too light, could bring public shame. But guilds also guarded secrets fiercely. Recipes, techniques, and measurements were locked away like sacred knowledge. Outsiders, especially foreigners and women, were rarely admitted. The system was strict, but it gave craftsmen a kind of dignity unknown to peasants or soldiers. In Florence, silk guilds financed cathedrals. In Paris, cobblers and butchers organised city politics. In Cologne, metalworkers wielded enough power to challenge bishops. The guilds didn't just make goods, they made identity. To say, I am a weaver or I am a smith, was to belong to something permanent. Your work carried your name, your mark, your worth. It was, in its way, the first middle class, a world of people who earned not from birthright or battle, but from skill. And in their workshops of wood and stone, the idea of economic independence quietly took root. While craftsmen built cities, merchants connected them. Their journeys began before dawn, wagons loaded with barrels of wine, cloth, or spices creaking out from city gates. The roads they followed were dangerous, rutted, muddy, often ruled by thieves or soldiers who demanded tolls. Yet merchants went anyway, driven by hope and calculation. To make money as a medieval merchant was to live with risk. A storm at sea, a broken axle, a dishonest partner. Any could destroy a year's fortune. But success brought freedom few others knew. A merchant could cross frontiers, speak with nobles and monks, and see the world beyond the horizon. They carried not only goods but news, ideas and fashions. A scarf from Damascus could change the style of a French court. A barrel of English wool could fund an Italian banker's cathedral. Markets became meeting points of languages and currencies. In the fairs of Champagne, one might hear German, Italian, and Arabic in the same hour. Deals were struck with gestures, sealed with wine, and written on parchment, one of the earliest forms of international law. Some merchants formed partnerships, pooling risk. Others specialised. One dealt in spices, another in metals, another in cloth. The cleverest invested in both ships and roads, earning not from one cargo, but from many. And yet, behind every transaction lay a fragile web of trust. There were no credit cards, no banks as we know them. A merchant relied on a handshake and a letter bearing a wax seal. For those who thrived, wealth became generational. Families like the Fuggers of Germany or the Medici of Italy began as traders and ended as financiers of kings. But for every wealthy merchant, hundreds failed, swallowed by debt, disease, or a single shipwreck. Still, they kept moving, because the road itself was opportunity. To trade was to gamble with fortune, and in that gamble Europe's heartbeat quickened. Money made some uneasy. The medieval church taught that greed was one of the 7 deadly sins and condemned usury, charging interest on loans as theft of time which belonged to God. Yet the church itself was deeply involved in finance. Every Christian owed tithes, 1/10 of all earnings, paid not in money but goods. Wealthy families bought indulgences, built chapels, or donated land to secure their souls. Monasteries accumulated wealth, and some became centres of lending, discreetly, under religious cover. In Paris, theologians debated whether a merchant who risked his goods could justly charge for that risk. In Florence, Franciscan friars created charitable loan houses, Monte Pietatis, to offer low-interest loans to the poor, balancing morality with need. Money, faith, and guilt intertwined like threads in a tapestry. Everyone wanted salvation, but few could resist the shine of silver. Money as trust made metal, and trust made paper came next. By the 13th century, the merchant's need for safe exchange gave birth to a new profession, the money changer. Seated behind wooden counters, or banker in Italian from which we get bank, They weighed coins, noted debts, and issued letters of exchange. In Italian cities like Siena, Florence, and Genoa, these men built empires from ink. A merchant in Bruges could deposit funds with the Medici in Florence, and his partner in Venice could withdraw them days later, all through written documents called bills of exchange. No gold needed to move. This was revolutionary. Money had become an idea, a promise, not a weight of silver. Bankers used ledgers filled with looping handwriting, the earliest double-entry bookkeeping. Every debit was balanced by a credit. Every profit had a cost. The system made numbers behave like morality, equal, accountable, and clear. Yet wealth came with moral danger. Many saw bankers as suspicious, manipulating money that was not their own. In 1345, the great Bardi and Peruzzi banks collapsed, ruining merchants across Europe. Entire families went from wealth to beggary overnight. Still, the idea survived. From these counting houses emerged the architecture of finance that still shapes the world today. The Medici mastered it, turning profit into art, investing in painters, scholars, and popes. Their bank branches reached London, Lyon, and Constantinople. They proved that money, managed wisely, could buy influence greater than crowns. Meanwhile, in smaller towns, local lenders copied their methods. Jewish and Lombard financiers offered loans when Christian law forbade interest. Poor labourers borrowed against harvests, while towns borrowed for walls and bridges. For the first time, Europe lived on credit. A farmer's plough, a bishop's chapel, a merchant's ship, all built on promises written in ledgers. Coins might still jingle in purses, but the true wealth now lay in numbers. And in that quiet revolution of ink and trust, the medieval world began to look uncannily like our own. In a world dominated by men, women still found ways to earn. Widows inherited workshops and ran them with skill. In England, alewives brewed beer for sale, sometimes enough to support entire families. In France, silk weaving and cloth dyeing often relied on female labour. In the Low Countries, women sold dairy, candles, and lace. Some nuns managed estates for their convents, others copied manuscripts or brewed medicines sold to travellers. Marriage contracts sometimes included dowries or written promises that gave women partial control of property. Rare freedoms compared to earlier centuries. The law rarely favoured them, but skill and persistence did. In marketplaces from Ghent to Florence, a woman's coin weighed the same as any man's, even if her voice did not. As trade reached new horizons, so did ambition. By the 14th century, merchant families became patrons of art and politics. The Medici financed painters and popes. Hanseatic merchants in Lubeck and Hamburg formed leagues to protect trade routes and crush piracy. Ships carried wool, grain, and salt across the North Sea and the Mediterranean. Roads once haunted by bandits now echoed with caravans and carts, but wealth brought risk and jealousy. Taxes grew heavier, wars more expensive. Merchants learned to hide their fortunes in stones. Churches, palaces, and tombs carved with folded hands praying for forgiveness. Still, they built a new idea of prosperity, one that valued skill, calculation, and ambition over lineage. The seeds of capitalism lay quietly beneath the cobblestones of medieval cities. What remains when the coins have vanished, when the markets have gone silent, and the ledgers have turned to dust? Not the numbers, not the wealth, but the work. The story of medieval Europe is not the story of kings or knights, but of labour. Millions of hands shaping a civilization grain by grain, nail by nail. When we think of making money today, it's easy to imagine power, freedom, success. But to a peasant, a craftsman, or a merchant, it meant something simpler. Survival, purpose, dignity. A peasant's harvest might feed dozens beyond his field. A blacksmith's tools armed a knight or built a bridge. A weaver's cloth carried warmth to strangers far away. Every coin was not just payment, but recognition, a small proof that effort mattered. And though the world has changed, that truth has not. Money in medieval Europe was more than metal. It was memory, a record of trust between people who might never meet. It turned invisible bonds, obligation, service, craftsmanship, into something tangible. The monk who counted tithes by candlelight could not have imagined digital banks. The merchant who feared pirates on the Rhine could not have foreseen global trade, but their instinct, to measure, to save, to create value through work, that still lives in us. In a way, the modern world is built upon their experiments. Our contracts descend from their promises, our wages from their trades, our ambitions from their hunger for stability. And yet they would have understood our fears too, the uncertainty of change, the worry of losing what we've earned, the quiet longing to find meaning in work that consumes our days, because for all their distance they were still human. They still worried about rent, food, taxes, and fate. They still prayed that tomorrow would be kinder. The coins they touched are gone, but their fingerprints remain on every building, every craft, every tradition that turned survival into culture. If we look closely, we can still see them, in the cobblestones beneath our feet, in the quiet pride of someone who finishes a task well, in the invisible thread that ties labour to worth and worth to hope. The Middle Ages did not teach people how to be rich. It taught them how to endure and to turn endurance into creation. So if you could go back and live in that world, would you have made money? Maybe. But more importantly, you would have made something lasting. Not gold, not silver, but meaning. And perhaps that, across the centuries, is the only true currency that never loses its value.